Winter had settled over Dustfall Ridge like a silent covenant, laying its pale hand across rooftops, fences, and the hollow spaces between people's hearts. Marshal Rowan Hale rode through the snow-muted street, his breath rising in ghostly threads, as though his grief were trying to escape his body in small, exhausted sighs. For 9 long days, mountains had swallowed his younger brother Eli without leaving more than a rumor of footsteps in the fresh powder. Rowan carried a look that belonged to a man who had once outrun danger, but could not outrun memory. A former Navy SEAL turned frontier lawman, he faced the heavy truth that deserts and battlefields had never shaken him the way these winter plains did places where you could lose someone without hearing a shot fired. He dismounted slowly, not from age, but from the weight of guilt. Folks watched from behind frosted glass, their silhouettes half hidden by the glow of lanterns. It was not malice in their curiosity, just the old Western habit of turning tragedy into talk. In Dustfall Ridge, every person knew the ache of someone missing, yet each whispered differently when the Hale family's sorrow came up. Rowan felt those whispers crawl against the back of his neck. A man could survive a knife wound, but not the quiet doubts of a town that believed he'd already failed. As he crossed the street, soft crunching sound behind him made him pause. A small figure stepped into view, bundled in an oversized coat, her mittened hands clasping a leather leash. Fia Morono, taller than Rowan's belt, Buckles stood there, with winter-pink cheeks and eyes the color of thawing ice. At her side, Dusty, a shaggy mutt, with a coat thick enough to shame a bear, sniffed the air with slow, thoughtful breaths. Fia lifted her chin, timid yet unafraid of his sorrow. "Marshal," she murmured, the word trembling like a snowflake about to fall. "My dog can find your brother," Rowan blinked, taken aback not by her claim but by the earnestness behind it. Dustfall Ridge had its share of dreamers, but Fia had always been different quiet. Observant, carrying grief too old for her age. Ever since the mine collapse took her father, the child had drifted through the town like a wandering soul seeking a place to land. He lowered himself to her height, his voice barely a thread. "Fia, that's kind of you." But the mountains, a murmur from the porch of the general store, clipped his words. Martha Callow, wrapped in a quilt shawl, whispered something sharp to the man beside her. Rowan didn't need to hear it. Gossip didn't require ears to wound. They thought Fia strange. They thought Rowan desperate. They thought Dusty nothing more than a scrapping mutt. Fia heard it too. Her shoulders curled inward, and Dusty pressed closer against her knee, offering silent comfort. Rowan exhaled slowly. He wished he had gentler words. He wished he had hope left to offer anyone. But winter had taken the warmth out of him. "I'm sorry, little one. It's not a job for a child." Fia's eyes glistened with a heartbreak far too familiar to Rowan. She wasn't asking to be believed. She was asking not to be dismissed. And before he could try again, she reached into her coat pocket and placed something in his palm. A tiny wooden bird, carved with careful, uneven strokes. Its wings stretched as though caught in mid-flight. "My father made it for me," she whispered. "He said hope is a small thing that keeps people warm. I think you need it more now." Rowan swallowed hard, unable to speak. Her offering felt like a spark pressed into his frozen hands. Dusty stepped forward, sniffed Rowan's glove, then nudged it with quiet insistence. Rowan looked down at the dog, those steady amber eyes, that patient expression. Not excitement, not guessing. Something deeper, something that felt like knowing. For a moment, Rowan forgot the onlookers and the whispers. The winter air between him and the child felt strangely warm. When he stood, a soft voice called to him from a nearby porch. Sabine Crow, the town's healer, watched with a look that held neither pity nor judgment, just understanding, deep and wordless. She had always carried calm like a lantern through dark rooms. "You don't have to believe the whole world, Rowan," she said gently. "Just believe the part that's still alive inside you." Her words lingered long after she disappeared into her home. And though she'd said nothing more, Rowan felt something fragile stir within him, like the faint warmth of a forgotten ember. That night, he sat alone in his cabin, rotating the wooden bird between his fingers. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines with a sound like distant weeping. He placed Eli's glove on the table, staring at the frayed stitches. A piece of wool clung to its cuff, a reminder of how small and mortal they both were. The room felt unbearably empty. Then, scratching sound at the door, Dusty pushed his way inside before Rowan could react, shaking snow across the floorboards. Behind him stood Fia, her face lit by determination rather than fear. "He followed your scent," she whispered. "He won't leave you. And he won't leave Eli." Rowan opened his mouth to protest, but something broke within him instead. A crack in the ice around his heart big enough for one fragile truth to slip through. Couldn't search alone anymore. "All right," he whispered, stroking Dusty's fur. "Show me where to start." Fia's relief was so soft it almost went unnoticed. Just a faint easing of the shoulders, a faint warming of the eyes. Within the hour, the three of them crossed the sleeping town, the lantern in Rowan's hand casting a golden trail on the snow. Windows flickered open as they passed. Old Pike muttered about foolish missions. Martha Callow clucked her tongue, as though disappointment were a language she loved to speak. But there were other quiet figures at their thresholds, offering nothing but the respect given to those who dare hope in a cruel season. Dusty led them past the last outpost, and into the wild, where winter lived without mercy. Their breaths rose into the darkness like prayers. For the first time in days, Rowan felt Eli's name in his chest without it splintering him. Fia walked beside him, her mitten occasionally brushing his coat. Not intentional, not bold. Just a small human closeness that kept the cold from swallowing him whole. Rowan found himself glancing at her, wondering how a child who had lost so much could still stand so gently in the world. Hours slipped by in a slow rhythm of footsteps and fragile faith. Dusty paused often, sniffing the wind, listening to things Rowan could not hear. The deeper they traveled, the more Rowan felt pulled by the terrain, not by fear but memory. Eli learning to skip stones by the creek. Eli running ahead on the trail, laughing at how Rowan always pretended to be out of breath. Eli leaning on him after their mother's funeral, promising they'd always stay together. Rowan's throat tightened. Fia noticed. "You're thinking of him?" she said quietly, not prying, simply knowing. Rowan nodded, unable to speak. "My mama used to say missing someone means there was love. The world should be kind to people who loved." She walked a little closer. "But it isn't always kind. So we have to be kind instead." Her voice landed softly inside him, a balm he didn't expect. The storm picked up, pushing snow across the ridges like a restless tide. Dusty suddenly darted toward a narrow ravine, barking with fierce urgency. Rowan's pulse jumped. They followed him to the edge, the lantern shaking in Rowan's hand. There, caught on a thorn bush, hung a torn scrap of cloth blue wool. Frayed and frozen stiff, Rowan fell to one knee, touching it with trembling fingers. Eli's jacket. A sound escaped him, half breath, half prayer. Fia knelt beside him, her small hand resting gently over his. Dusty sniffed the edge of the ravine, tail stiff with certainty. Rowan rose, gripping the lantern tighter. Above them, the sky cracked open with the first flakes of a new storm, drifting down like the slow fall of ash. The mountains loomed, dark and unknowable. "We're close," he whispered, and as the wind howled across the ridge, Rowan stepped forward into the deepening storm. Fia and Dusty at his side, three small figures moving toward the heart of winter, toward the thin, trembling thread of hope that refused to break. The farther they climbed into the mountains, the more winter stripped the world of color, leaving only the whites and grays of a place that demanded resilience. Rowan felt the cold digging beneath his coat like needles searching for marrow, yet he pushed forward because Dusty's sudden urgency had lit a new fire inside him. The dog moved with sharp, knowing steps, his nose pressed low. His tail held like a compass, pointing toward a single fragile truth. Eli was still out here. Fia walked in steady rhythm beside Rowan, her steps lighter than the snow allowed. She watched the shadows between pine trunks as though listening to secrets carried through the frozen branches. Rowan found himself glancing at her, not out of concern, but out of awe. This child, who had every reason to shrink from the world, walked with a bravery shaped from kindness rather than pride. As they reached a narrow bluff, Dusty suddenly halted. His body stiffened, ears perked, breath frozen in a visible plume. The silence pressed around them until Rowan could hear the expanding crack of ice beneath the snowdrifts. The world felt poised, holding its breath. "Something's near," Fia whispered, her voice a thread in the cold. Rowan stepped forward and cupped his hands around his mouth. Eli, the name burst from him, echoing across the canyon wall like a plea cast into eternity at first. Nothing answered. Then a faint sound floated back, then fragile. Wavering like a dying ember resisting the dark, Rowan froze, his heart thundering so hard it almost hurt. He called again, and this time the echo carried a quivering reply, so faint he could barely trust it. But Dusty knew. Dusty dashed toward a narrow fissure in the stone, barking with fierce hope. Rowan knelt and held the lantern close. The flame wavered in the winter wind, casting ripples of gold across the cave's mouth. Inside, he glimpsed what looked like a small mound of snow-covered branches. Then a finger twitched. A hand stirred. A breath shuddered into the air. Rowan reached inside, voice cracking. "Eli, I'm here, kid. I'm right here." The boy's eyelids fluttered. His lips parted in a hoarse whisper that barely carried. "Rowan. I knew you'd come." The relief that washed over Rowan was so immense he nearly sank to his knees. He pulled Eli gently into his arms, wrapping him in his coat, whispering comforts that broke mid-breath. Fia watched with a trembling smile, blinking back tears she didn't want Rowan to see. Dusty circled them, as if guarding something holy, but winter is jealous of what it tries to claim. A sudden low groan rumbled through the earth beneath them. Snow shifted. Rowan looked up, just as a wave of powder thundered down the ridge. Fia screamed for cover. Dusty barked with warning. Rowan shielded Eli with his body, but the avalanche struck the cave entrance, sealing them inside in a deafening roar of white weight. When the rumbling subsided, the lantern flickered weakly in the stillness. The only exit was half-choked with ice and rock, leaving just enough gap for cold air to seep through. Darkness pressed tightly around them. Rohan felt panic coil in his chest, but Fia's small hand touched his sleeve again. "We're not trapped," she whispered softly. "We just haven't left yet." The simplicity of her words steadied him in ways he could not explain. Eli shivered violently. Rowan pulled him closer, sharing whatever warmth his body still held. The boy's skin was like ice, but his heartbeat was there, thin, but present. Rowan pressed his forehead to Eli's, murmuring promises he had once feared he'd never get to speak again. Fia crouched beside Dusty. "He can dig," she murmured, stroking his thick fur. Dusty's ears twitched at her words, and he pressed toward the blocked entrance, sniffing for pockets of weakness. Rowan joined him, pushing at the frozen debris with bare hands until his fingers bled. But the cave fought back with stubborn silence. Rowan paused, breath ragged. Memories from his Navy SEAL days flickered unbidden, nights trapped in collapsed structures, waiting for extraction teams, knowing the body's warmth dwindled faster than hope. He had always been the one pulling others out. Now he was the one depending on a child and a dog. He closed his eyes. Sabine's voice rose inside him, soft as snowfall. "Your strength isn't in your fists, Rowan. It's in your gentleness." He drew in a deep breath, steadied himself, and began chipping the ice with slow, purposeful hands instead of desperate force. Fia followed his rhythm, brushing aside small shards. Dusty dug with renewed vigor, paws scraping until one broke through a thin layer of softer snow. A gasp of frigid wind whistled through the small opening. "There," Fia said, pointing. "That's our way." Her voice carried a quiet triumph that made Rowan believe again. They worked together, human hands and dog paws until the exit grew just wide enough for Dusty to push through fully. The dog squeezed outside, shook snow from his fur, and barked at the world with fierce announcement. Rowan heard distant echoes from the valley below. Lights. Voices. Had Sabine sent a search party after all? Rowan lifted Eli and crawled through the opening. Fia closed behind him. The storm met them like a living wall, its icy breath sharp against their faces. The wind howled like a wild animal, but lantern lights bobbed faintly in the distance. People were coming. The town Rowan once believed had judged him, most harshly, was now climbing into the cold for him. He staggered through the storm with Eli in his arms, Fia holding onto his coat, Dusty trotting beside them despite his exhaustion. Snow fell in thick curtains, softening the world to a blur. But Rowan kept his eyes on those lantern lights' small flames, carried by people who suddenly mattered more than he'd ever let himself admit. As they neared the valley floor, a figure broke from the group and ran toward them. Sabine, her dark hair whipped by the wind, her shawl trailing behind like a wounded wing. She reached Rowan, pressing her hands to Eli's cheeks, her breath hitching with relief. "You found him," she whispered. "You brought him home?" Rowan's voice broke. "We found him. All of us." Fia stepped quietly back, letting Sabine take over with the tenderness of a mother tending a wounded child. Dusty sat beside Fia, leaning into her as though sharing the moment in silence. The storm eased slightly, its roar softening to a hush, as if winter itself paused to witness what hope had achieved. The townsfolk surrounded them, forming a sheltering circle, their lanterns held like blessings cupped in gentle hands. Martha Callow wiped her eyes despite pretending she wasn't crying. Old Pike grunted something that might have been an apology. The night was suddenly warmer, not in temperature, but in the way hearts turned toward one another. Rowan looked at Fia, the small girl who had stood beside him. When his soul was at its most fragile, he knelt before her, placing the wooden bird gently back into her mittened hands. "You were right," he said softly. "Hope keeps people warm." Fia smiled, and the expression lit her face like sunrise breaking through cloud, as they walked back toward Dustfall Ridge. Rowan carried Eli, and Sabine walked close beside him, her arm brushing his now and then, not a declaration, but the beginning of something quiet, something healing. Fia skipped lightly ahead with Dusty, leaving a trail of small footprints that seemed to stitch the world back together. When they reached the town's edge, Rowan paused and looked back at the path they had traveled, a long scar across the snow, marked by courage, loss, and rebirth. The wind had stilled. The mountains stood silent, humbled, and in that stillness, Rowan felt the truth settle inside him. Winter had not come to break them. It had come to teach them how fiercely a heart could burn when given a single fragile spark of hope. He turned toward the lantern-lit town and whispered to himself, "To the mountains, to the child who had saved them all, some storms don't take us. They return us." Then, in the gentle glow of Dustfall Ridge, they stepped forward together, carrying warmth where winter once ruled.